Hi, I'm Mark Beardsley, an ecologist and restoration practitioner with Ecometrics in Buena Vista, Colorado. I'm here to talk to you about partnering with beavers to restore Colorado mountain wetlands. Close your eyes and try to picture this riverscape as I read to you. Looking back some 35 years, we find Trout Creek, a fine mountain stream, banks lined with willows and shrubs, well stocked with mountain trout. The surrounding hills are covered with good stands of pine and fir, and the parks are covered with thick grass. The same section today presents a sadly different picture. The mountain stream is converted to a deep gully with perpendicular walls and a boulder-strewn bottom. The willows and shrubs are gone, the timber's been cut from the hillsides, and the grass has been replaced by a few stands of ping and sage. What were once mountain meadows are now barren peat beds. Open your eyes. Is this what you pictured? Yeah, me too. That's what I pictured when I read it. But this is a different stream. The stream I just described to you is actually this one. Trout Creek. Most of you have probably seen Trout Creek if you've driven along Highway 285 coming into my town of Buena Vista. Doesn't look a whole lot like what I described, does it? Well, what's the catch? What I didn't tell you is that the description I read came from a 1933 Civilian Conservation Corps report. The video I just showed you shows that same stretch that was described, and this is what it looks like today. Back in the 1930s, in the grips of the Great Depression, a couple of hundred out-of-work dudes descended on the degraded Trout Creek I just read to you about. They descended on it with hand tools, willow stems, and whatever materials they could gather on site to try to, in their words, bring back by human effort a portion of what man had destroyed. Those boys were doing low-tech process-based restoration. And why do you think it worked so well? Well, I think it's because they had Mother Nature on their side. By partnering with beavers, they enabled nature's wetland ecosystem engineers to do most of the work. Beavers are quintessential ecosystem engineers. Their work supports species richness and landscape-level heterogeneity. They're the keystone species that maintain the health and resilience of wetland ecosystems that they live in. People are decent engineers, but when it comes to wetland, beavers totally outshine us. To say they had a head start is an understatement. In the Beaver Manifesto, Glennis Hood's amazing book, she reminds us that by the time early hominid ancestors appeared on this earth, a short 5 million years ago, beavers had already learned to cut wood and build homes. Beavers build their homes like their lives depend on it, and that's because their lives do depend on it, and so do the lives of so many other species. Beavers are aquatic rodents, but somehow, by some magnificent evolutionary development, they came to inhabit arid environments like our Rocky Mountains, not by adapting to dry conditions, but by learning how to make dry places wet. Look at this little guy go. Beavers have everything you could want in a solid work partner. Smart, hardworking, meticulous, persistent, not afraid to get their hands a little dirty. To hear us beaver aficionados talk, it sometimes sounds like we're describing a comic book superhero that's going to swoop in and save us. I'm guilty myself. One of my favorite sweatshirts is a hoodie with this Super Beaver logo. But of course, beavers are just rodents. There's nothing at all magical about them. They have no superpowers. But what they do have is an unusual array of evolutionary adaptations, making them specialized for living in water. They have webbed feet and a big flat tail, which makes them amazingly graceful swimmers. They can hold their breath and stay underwater a very long time. They have an extra flap of tissue behind their teeth that they can close so they're able to chew and bite stuff under the water. Their eyes and ears are specialized for living underwater, and their fur is so dense it keeps them dry and insulated. They're also big and fat. Adult beavers tend to be around 60 to 70 pounds, the size of a Labrador retriever. And the fat they store all summer helps them keep alive through long winters. They're strict vegetarians, and mountain beavers survive winter by caching branches underwater so that they can eat them when they get iced in. More impressive, though, are their adaptations for manipulating their environment. Like most rodents, they have fossorial forepaws. Fossorial? Well, that's just a fancy word that means they're really good for digging. And they also have iron, hard, chiseled teeth that they use to cut through trees. They're powerfully strong for their size, and their senses can detect moving water, triggering them to plug the water up. Lots of mammal species adapted to life in water, some in extreme ways like dolphins and whales, and others more subtly like otters and muskrats. But the beaver is unique in its ability to create the very wetlands they need to live in. In a long history of evolutionary development, beavers came to inhabit arid environments like our Rocky Mountains, as I said, not by adapting to dry conditions, but by making them wet. I shot this video while camping in Taylor Park this summer. That mound of sticks you see in the middle of the pond is a lodge that the beavers built. There's a dry chamber in there where they hang out, and the entrances are underwater. This beaver is busy packing mud on the walls to make it hard and insulated for winter. And the leafy willows that the beaver's swimming by right now in front of the food cache? Well, when the pond freezes over, this is a store of food that remains accessible to them underneath the ice. Here's a picture of that same beaver working on his lodge. And here's what a beaver lodge looks like in winter. The lodge is back to the right, and that pile of sticks frozen in the ice is the top of their food cache. Some of those bubbles in the ice are actually frozen beaver breath from when the beaver exhales while swimming out from the underwater entrance to his lodge beneath the ice to sneak a little snack from the food cache. And here's just a few more pictures of mountain beaver world in winter. In cold places like the Rockies, beaver ponds need to be deep enough so they don't freeze solid. That's one of the main reasons beavers build dams. And beavers build their lodges, dams, and ponds all by themselves. This is one of the kid beavers, probably 1.5-year-old, packing mud and sticks into a 3-foot tall beaver dam. And that dam she built is the sole reason there's a pond and wetland here. She's digging the mud up from the bed of the pond, so she's actually making it deeper in 2 ways, by digging it down and by raising the water level up the dam. Beautiful work, young lass. Why walk when you could swim? That's how aquatic animals think. Here's a typical beaver lodge and pond on a typical Colorado subalpine creek. By extending the dam to make the pond wide and building the networks of tunnels, canals, and channels that beavers build, they give themselves access to the full width of the valley without ever having to leave the water. That arrow is pointing to the lodge. Now let's zoom out and look at that whole complex. Yeah, the wetlands that beavers create are called complexes because, well, they're complex. The arrow shows where I was standing when I took that last photo, looking upstream. When a beaver population begins to expand into multiple colonies, the wetland expands too. While sites like this seem rare today, a mere 200 to 300 years ago, most of Colorado's broad mountain valleys were just like this. The point of this is just to help you understand what beavers do and why they do it. It's just how they make their living. Beavers build their wetland homes like their lives depend on it, and that's because their lives do depend on it, and so do the lives of so many other species. By just following their own survival instincts, beavers create and maintain the most biologically rich and biodiverse habitats we have. That's why we call them ecosystem engineers. And moose approve. When I say beaver complexes are biologically rich and diverse, I mean biologically rich and diverse. One of the most fascinating talks I ever saw on mountain beavers was by an ecologist from Montana named Tory Ritter. He built this slide to illustrate the diversity of life that depends on beaver complexes. Without beavers, this complexity and diversity breaks down and the ecosystem becomes depauperate, much simpler and less alive. Colorado Parks and Wildlife refers to beaver as umbrella species, because conservation of an umbrella species like beavers leads to the conservation of so many other species that depend on them and the habitats they build. Beavers are umbrella species, keystone species, and ecosystem engineers, all wrapped up in one. Not all superheroes are supernatural. Beavers don't even need a Lycra underwear suit or a cape to be super. Complex and biodiverse mountain wetland habitats like this are not anomalies. This is 4 Mile Creek in Pike National Forest. Rough and Tumbling Creek, also on the Pike. Going downstream into South Park, Here's a nice beaver complex in the Middle Fork of the South Platte River. Homestake Creek on the White River National Forest. Tennessee Creek in the San Isabel. Taylor River on the Gunnison. Willow Creek, a tributary to the Taylor. West Willow Creek, a tributary to Willow Creek, which is a tributary to the Taylor. And this is Red Mountain Creek. It's just another headwater stream in Taylor Park. Cucumber Gulch near Breckenridge. Pass Creek near Salida. One thing these amazingly complex Rocky Mountain beaver wetland riverscapes have in common is, obviously, beavers. Complex, highly functional, productive, and resilient natural riverscapes like this are why I think we should partner with beavers, because, given half a chance, this is what beavers strive to create and maintain. This stream isn't your granddad's simple riffled pool meandering channel. It's ecological productivity to the max, and aquatic habitat galore. People have been preaching the benefits of beaver for a long time, but for most of my career, beaver appreciation has been mostly relegated to the fringes. You didn't talk about beavers and wetlands and stream restoration classes 10 years ago, because back then stream restoration was all about channel stability, shear stress, sediment transport, and dimensionless ratios, physical things. You'd sometimes get ecologists and beaver nerds at the stream restoration conferences, but we'd usually be hanging out around the back of the room. But that story has definitely changed. When we started focusing on beavers and wetlands in the mid-2000s, it was like we were shouting into the wilderness. Now, when we go around talking about them, it feels more like we're singing to the choir. It's with great restraint that I limited myself to just one graph in this presentation, and this is it. I'm happy to report that appreciation for beavers is skyrocketing, as you can see by the graph. Beavers have gone mainstream, and that's good news if you like mountain wetlands. If you're new, there are plenty of good books you can read to get caught up on the beaver's awesomeness. New ones and old ones. I've already mentioned a few, and here are some more of my favorites. That top one by Enos Mills was published in 1913, one of my favorites. The bottom one by Ben Goldfarb came out in 2018, probably the best one. These are absolute must-reads, in my opinion. You should also check out Sarah Konigsberg's award-winning documentary, The Beaver Believers. 5 scientists and a hairdresser taking a bite out of climate change, one stick at a time. In the flood of articles and special features coming out about beavers, there are a few that stand out. This one's from last summer's Montana Outdoors, and it's particularly amazing. Big on science, low on hype. The caption there in the lower left reads, "Almost eliminated. Before European settlement, an estimated 100 million beavers populated North America. The species was nearly wiped out by commercial trapping between the early 18th and 20th centuries. Numbers have since rebounded to they've since rebounded slightly to roughly 10% of pre-colonial times." They've rebounded to 10% of pre-colonial times? Well, that means we have 90% to go. That article had this excellent graphic of a mountain beaver complex. And if you take a look at it, we won't go through all of it right now, but it shows how complex these things are. You can see the beaver dam here in the foreground, holding back a pond, creating this pond with deep water. The lodge is in the middle of that pond. This is where the beaver lives. He can hang out in this nice dry area right here. A nice dry, safe spot to hang out with an underwater entrance, keeping him safe. Notice the stump in the background where the beavers felled a tree. And you can see that tree, the vegetation that grows along these is specially adapted to life among beavers. It's sprouting a new one. It's not dead. This is called coppicing. When beavers chop down trees, they sprout again. Things like cottonwoods and willows are specially adapted for this. And then notice all the biodiversity of all the animals and all the different life stages of all the different animals that make use of this habitat. This mountain lion looks like she's trying to figure out how to break into the lodge to get those yummy beaver treats inside. Amphibians, leopard frogs, and boreal toads are common to beaver complexes in Colorado, or at least they used to be when beavers were common. These complexes retain water, and that helps with flood dissipation and drought refuge. They also recharge groundwater. They're good. And the groundwater is where a lot of the biogeochemical processing happens that keeps water clean. It works like a filter. They're also really important for wildfire. The role of beavers and beaver complexes in wildfire ecology has been a very hot topic recently. Mountain beaver wetlands are critical refuges for all kinds of plants and animals in wildfires because they're the last of the habitats to burn, and often the only green areas that remain in the aftermath of large fires. NPR and KUNC did several stories about beavers related to the recent Colorado megafires. One of the other benefits is how beaver complexes capture sediment and ash runoff from burn scars as it process it into soil. Ash and sediment running off of burn scars is a huge impact from fires, and beaver complexes are super important for mitigating those impacts, keeping water clean. This is water quality and natural infrastructure. Here's another recent article by the Audubon Society. But with popularity comes hype, so turn up your media savvy filter. If you have a newsfeed that recognizes you as a beaver nerd, get ready for a wave of silly articles like this. Unscrupulous writers can be pretty gauche about weaving beavers into all kinds of stories. This story says Ukrainian farmers are so busy fighting the war with Russia that they don't have time to control beavers, and that freed the beavers to create wetlands, which are impassable to Russian troops. If that photo in the foreground is their idea of a beaver complex, well, that doesn't say much for the Ukrainian beavers. Not to mention what it says about the lameness of the Russian troops unable to cross it. Oh wait, there's a bridge. Never mind. Point is, beavers are big in the news these days, and they're weaved into almost all kinds of stories. But the beaver wildfire relationship totally passes the skeptic's test. It's real, and it's real important. This photo from Utah University scientist Joe Wheaton shows the importance of a beaver complex, Emerald Refuge, in a giant fire burn scar in Idaho. When asked how these wetlands perform this critical service, Joe usually responds glibly, "Water doesn't burn." I love that beaver scientists also tend to be very practical people. Dr. Emily Fairfax has many peer-reviewed papers in prestigious scientific journals on the subject, but it may be her stop-motion video that does the most to communicate the role of beaver complexes in fire-prone landscapes. Check it out. Awesome. Ben Goldfarb highlights some of Joe Wheaton's and Emily Fairfax's scientific work in this National Geographic article. Dr. Fairfax goes into a little more detail beyond water doesn't burn. Streams with beavers, shown on the right, are the wetlands I've been showing you. Without beavers, the wetlands partially or wholly dry up as streams become more channelized. In wet periods, both sites are green as plants feed off infiltrating precipitation and runoff. But notice the difference on the beaver stream where the soil profile is saturated from retained water. It's like a soaked sponge. During dry conditions or drought, the riparian area of the non-beavery stream dries up and becomes tinder, while the Beavery stream stays wet and fire resistant. This is really just a graphical way of saying that beaver wetlands are a lot more resilient to drought and fire than de-beavered channel-sized streams. So the problem really comes down to this. Streams with beavers are way better than streams without beavers for all the reasons we just went over. And now, unfortunately, a lot fewer of our streams have beavers and a lot more of our streams don't. Our surveys in Colorado are right in line with what that Montana article stated, that our current loss of beaver wetland is probably around 90%. So why is that? And what can we do about it? To answer these questions, let's take a step back and consider our relationship with beavers over history. In his book, Eager, Ben Goldfarb says it's a history of commodification, conflict, and now, hopefully, collaboration. I like to think it began with coexistence. Indigenous American people lived with beaver for millennia. Some of them referred to beavers as the little people, a term that clearly shows respect and kinship. Here in the Rockies, the Arapaho and the Utes coexisted with the little people for millennia before European explorers arrived to find, and I quote, beavers in every water body that offered suitable habitat. At the time of colonial expansion, beaver pelts were the riches of the day, a great commodity. So imagine Europeans' delight in finding an El Dorado of fine fur in the waters of the New World. News from the explorers traveled fast among the people who knew beavers not as wetland ecosystem engineers or keystone species, but as the finest source of fur for making felt. They didn't think of beavers as little people. What they saw in beavers, as Francis Backhouse reminds us, were hats. Yes, beaver fur was used to make felt, to make hats, making it a great commodity. The days of the mountain men and fur trappers are highly romanticized, and it probably was a pretty adventurous life for the boys on the front lines. But the other side of that coin is a massive global industry fed by a few monopolistic companies that had only one thing in mind: to extract beaver fur and ship it across the sea by the most expedient and efficient means possible. And there were a lot of ships full of beaver pelts leaving the New World for the old in those days. By all accounts, the boys did a pretty thorough job of it. Beavers turned out to be easy to catch and kill. By the 1830s, Rocky Mountain states were considered fully trapped out. The fur trade dwindled after that, in part because hat aficionados began turning to silk instead of felt as the material of choice, but also because they ran out of beavers. And even though the colonial era fur trade has been over for about a couple centuries, beavers have been slow to reoccupy the mountain areas they were trapped out of. Enos Mills was one of several writers to lament the disappearance of the millions of beaver ponds that grace America's wilds at the time of the first settlers. He also wrote about the rich alluvial soils that beavers left in their legacy of dried-out valley bottom wetland. By the 1870s, nearly all the rich valleys in the Rockies were settled and converted to hard-working ranch lands and grazing allotments. When the few surviving beavers returned to the scene, they found their former habitats dried out and occupied by the one species that could easily outcompete them: Homo sapiens. In-sized river channels like this were the new normal. People got used to the simple, neat, single-thread channels that their streams had become, and we've worked hard to keep them that way. To restore a river, the way I was taught in the 90s and early 2000s anyway, well, that meant to stabilize this channel and dress up the water between the banks. This picture is of a project where $250,000 was spent in 2008 to make an in-sized channel a little more interesting for fish and fishermen, and people were rather proud of it. Nobody was thinking in those days about the dewatered wetlands on either side of the channel. Nobody was thinking about what this riverscape used to look like before the beavers were eradicated. We had mostly forgotten what natural riverscapes could be. It's called shifting baseline syndrome, or ecological amnesia. We quickly get used to new normals, and we're easily duped into setting our expectations according to them. Hearken the words of Thomas Paine. A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right and raises a formidable outcry in defense of custom. Wherever they can, over the past 200 years, beavers have tried to reclaim the valley bottom wetlands. But those efforts don't usually end up so well for the beavers when they run into people who got used to simple, well-behaved streams. Along with competition comes conflict. 3, 2, 1, boom! Some people are getting pretty serious about keeping their streams in line and beaver-free. And some aren't even done commodifying beavers. This South Carolina newspaper headline shows a pretty common response to municipal beaver conflicts. There are many places where beaver activity simply cannot be tolerated these days, and we need to be totally honest about that. But most perceived conflicts happen in places where any harm that the little people would do could be easily mitigated. If we make an effort to protect our stuff with fences and flow devices rather than with shotguns, traps, and dynamite, I'm sure there are plenty of places we can get along just fine. It shouldn't be hard to coexist with beavers in places like these. Coexistence is the first step towards collaboration. And collaborate is what we must do if we're serious about restoring wetlands on a scale that matters. We need to stop thinking of beavers as pests and start thinking of them as partners. These two pictures I've been showing are of Rough and Tumbling Creek in South Park. These are national forest sites that used to be heavily grazed, but like in a lot of places, economic pressure, ranching styles, and management goals have changed, so it's no longer necessary or desirable to maximize agricultural production at the expense of everything else in places like this. There's no reason to compete with beavers on this real estate, and no reason for conflict. What a perfect place to coexist and start a collaboration to restore wetland and watersheds for the benefit of people and wildlife. In Colorado alone, we have thousands of miles of stream that are just like this. That could be tens of thousands of wetland acres working to keep our watersheds resilient. What's stopping us? Well, not much, really. Ben Goldfarb's diagram from a 2018 Science magazine article illustrates the path from incised channel to complex wetland. The key is learning how to enable the keystone species and ecological engineers. It's about learning to partner with beavers. And the main obstacle has been a cultural one. Ecological amnesia, shifting baseline syndrome. I wouldn't say we're totally over that hump yet, but the tide has certainly shifted in the direction of beavers and wetlands. So let's get to work. Healthy beaver wetlands operate on a positive feedback loop. It's an ecological engine that keeps these wetland ecosystems dynamic, complex, and functioning. I call it an ecological machine, and the cool thing is that as long as all the parts are there, it functions totally on its own. When you think about it like this, our job as restoration practitioners is not to design and build these systems from scratch. It's to help them heal and function on their own. It's really about getting the important parts back in place so that natural processes can resume functioning. We call it process-based restoration. The first thing most of us think of when it comes to restoration is, hey, if beavers are so great at creating and maintaining wetland, why don't we just put them back and let them get to work? The strategy of reintroducing beavers for restoration goes back at least 100 years. The most audacious example was when Idaho Fish and Game dropped beavers by parachute into the Frank Church wilderness, hoping they would take seed and repopulate their riverscapes. Apparently, they even had some measure of success. Unfortunately, though, restoring degraded riverscapes is rarely as simple as just trucking or parachuting in a few beavers and letting them do all the work. If you drop off some beavers in a site like the one in the background, one that already has good riparian vegetation and enough ponds and wetlands to support beavers, well, then your efforts are really just replacing or enhancing the beaver part of the machine, and I say go for it. It's certainly better than killing nuisance beavers. As a restoration strategy, though, Beaver reintroduction seems to be effective only in places where all the other parts of the biological engine are already in place. It's hard to scale this up to a level that solves the environmental and watershed problems we're facing, because in most cases, all those parts aren't already in place. One of the problems is that many of our degraded riverscapes have become inhospitable to beavers. Sites like the one in this picture have nothing left of the machinery needed to support them. You can't just drop a beaver off in a place like this and expect her to restore it from scratch. You know that poor little beaver is pleading, please, please don't leave me here. The other problem is that transplanted beavers rarely stay put, and they rarely flourish into growing colonies, even in the best circumstances. It's also extremely expensive. Relocation is one tool in the toolbox, for sure, but it's not one that I think has a lot of promise at a large scale. I think we've got to do more. Another factor that we can restore is vegetation and wood. To our beaver partners, riparian vegetation is pretty much everything. It's their food, it's their shelter, it's their building material. Lots of our impaired riverscapes don't have a prayer of supporting beaver or beaver wetland until we get some riparian plants back. Restoring native woody vegetation, well, it can be a long process, but it's often a critical one. You can't get that engine to work unless we get all the parts. And if it takes time, well, it takes time. We can be patient on streams like this. This beaver restoration success story was all about riparian vegetation, and it took more than a decade to unfold. The left photo shows the reach in 2008, looking pretty much like it has since the 1800s. The right photo shows the same spot in 2016, after planting willows and managing livestock to get the vegetation back. And here it is in 2020. After beavers decided, finally, that there was enough food and shelter to move back in. Look, all the parts of the machine are back. The other cogs we can restore are the structural parts, the beaver dams and channels, the ponds and the wetland. In this row, we're basically mimicking what beavers would do if they were still there. Although the idea is centuries old, human-built copies of beaver dams, or as we now call them, beaver dam analogs, or BDAs, those suddenly seem to be on everybody's radar. The immediate hydrological response to beaver dam analogs can be very impressive, as these photos clearly show. Put in a BDA, create a pond. Voila! But that's just part of their story. Remember, the BDAs are temporary. There are efforts to mimic what beavers do. But so the BDAs are temporary, but the process of beaver dam building and wetland maintenance is ongoing. The short-term goal of BDAs is to mimic beavers. The long-term goal is to promote and sustain the biological feedback that they're part of. Our measure of success isn't just how a BDA looks when we're done building it. It's also about how well we've promoted and sustained the machinery that keeps the wetland alive and functioning. We build a lot of BDAs. Here we are doing it. And we try to make them as close to natural beaver dams as possible. We use the same materials that beavers use. They're purposefully low-tech and not at all complicated to build. In fact, they're really fun to build, and you get instant gratification. But they're also, by definition and by design, temporary treatments that ultimately get washed out and absorbed into the riverscape, just like real beaver dams do. Ta-da! And just because it's fun, here's another time lapse. Compared to people, beavers make it look so darn easy. I started this talk off with a story about a 1933 Civilian Conservation Corps project that restored a mountain wetland by partnering with beavers. And I want to end by telling you a story about how we're basically doing the same thing now, 90 years later. Mimicking beavers, sustaining them, or promoting them to come back and hopefully sustaining them for the long-term existence. This is Trail Creek in Taylor Park. It would be a pretty nice riparian corridor in this condition, except that it has a big incised gash draining it, and there's no beavers. This site's about 3 miles long. We're looking at just the bottom mile. The beauty of the low-tech process-based restoration approach, as the boys in the 1930s proved, is that you can treat big, long sections of stream quite cheaply and with little disturbance. A lot of the work's done by hand. Here, Forest Service hydrologist Ashley Hom is directing volunteers in the construction of a beaver dam analog. More hands means more BDAs. And you need a lot of BDAs really to make a difference. The BDAs, the beaver dam analogs we build are much smaller than the real dams that beavers can build. So we have to build a lot of them. We can ease the labor burden by using small machines to assist with the repetitive tasks. But the challenge with using machines is to always resist the urge to overbuild BDAs and always to resist the tendency for disturbance. We want to keep that to a minimum. We're constantly reminding ourselves that we're mimicking beavers. We're not building dams. We set up most of our projects so that local volunteers, students, interns, apprentices, and young professionals get to work right alongside old gray-bearded practitioners and scientists and land managers, creating an excellent learning environment. This is a Western State Environmental Science Master's student class being put to work. They're also learning a lot, learning by doing. The way to make these projects a key to success in these projects is doing treatments on a large scale. On Trail Creek, we used 316 mimicry structures, from very tiny ones to some pretty good sized ones, over about 1.4 stream corridor miles and 45 acres. The photos below show a sequence before and immediately after treatment. Here's what some of the treatments look like immediately before and after the structures were built. And another example. And another. No one structure can mimic the processes beavers perform. BDAs work together in tandem over large complexes. On sites like Trail Creek, where beavers have come and gone sporadically over the years, there's lots of beaver infrastructure on the dried out floodplain. So most of what our treatments do is really just help the water find these features again. Low-hanging fruit sites like this offer immediate gratification in terms of ecological uplift and a greater chance for long-term success. Before, after, before. I stopped talking because these pictures pretty much speak for themselves. That's the same site after beavers have moved back in. So that sequence was neat because it shows with no beavers, it shows our attempts to mimic beavers, and here what happens when beavers come back and take over the work. And there's our little guy, hard at work. And again, it's the systemic response that matters, not any one little structure. We have to zoom out and look at it, look at the wetland as a whole, the whole complex. So here's a shot of the stream before we did any treatments. After we installed some BDAs, after beavers moved back in, and after beavers had been there for a season. And another section just downstream before with some treatment, with a few more treatments and some beavers. And after beavers have had some time to do some work themselves. Pretty neat. And why not? This is the reach that we did the restoration work, and it wouldn't have succeeded unless we can mimic beavers, but it wouldn't have succeeded to this degree if we weren't able to also promote and sustain the real ecological engineer, the real keystone species, and the real umbrella species. Yeah, it's unfortunate. 90% of our beaver population has been lost. But just think about all the benefits we could achieve if we could get at least a portion of the beavers back. Huge thanks to Ann Lowe, wildlife photographer in Breckenridge and resource conservationist, for taking this amazing picture of our restoration partner. And a huge thanks to all the people working to restore beavers and beaver wetlands across the state. A bunch of us got together and put together a little song that I want to finish with, performed by wetland ecologist extraordinaire, Dr. Brad Johnson. Take it away, Brad.
Problem of a beavery type. The beavers built a dam made of sticks and mud. Road was washing out, it started to flood. Because the beavers came back to restore all the trees. The beavers came back, they built us all a wetland. The beavers came back, they didn't want to go away, way, way, way. Came to town to dispatch this plight. He blew the dam apart with some dynamite. Another man came, took the beavers away. They put them in a trap and collected their pay. But the beavers came back the very next day. The beavers came back. We thought that they were gonna. The beavers came back. They just wouldn't stay away, way, way, way. When the man came back, found a whole nother dam. He said it's time to implement a previous plan. This time when he trapped him, he wouldn't be undone. Off the beaver head, he sent him with his gun. But my beavers came back. It must have been some others. My beavers came back. The sisters and the brothers. The beavers came back. They just wouldn't stay away, way, way, way. Then Mike came to town with whole perspective. He said, you know, the beaver land is very effective, creating habitat, biodiversity, resilience to drought, floods, and water quality. He said that we can live with beavers, that would sure be nice. We can solve this problem with a clever device. Now the pipe keeps the flowing and the problem's being corrected. The wetland is a thriving and the road is protected. The beavers are back, never say never. The beavers are back, we hope they stay forever. The beavers are back, now we don't have to send them away, way, way, way. Everybody wins when the beavers are allowed to stay, 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 stay. Let the beavers let them stay, let the beavers let them stay. Let them stay.